GDP growth for the first quarter of 2025 officially came in negative. It came in at negative 0.3%. Now, Trump is blaming this on Biden. What is actually going on? And more importantly, does this mean that we're headed towards a recession? That's what we're going to talk about here today. As always, my name is Derek and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Let's dive right in. Okay, so to start, let's get a few things out of the way. The first is that Trump is blaming this on Biden. He did this officially.
Some numbers today, and I have to start off by saying that's Biden, that's not Trump, because we came in on January, this is the quarterly numbers, and we came in and I was very against everything that Biden was doing in terms of the economy, destroying our country in so many ways. Not only at the border was more obvious, but we took over his mess in so many different ways.
Now, is it Biden's fault or is it Trump's fault? Well, it's interesting to see that basically for close to 3 years, the 3 previous years, we've had consecutive, consistent GDP growth. Then Trump comes into office, and the very first quarter that he is president, we experience negative GDP growth. So that is already suggesting that it's probably something to do with Trump. Now, what is actually happening? Well, first we have to understand, and I actually just made a video about this, we have to understand how GDP is calculated, okay? GDP is calculated by basically equaling it to consumption, to investment, to spending, to exports minus imports, which is the trade surplus or trade deficit. Okay. Now, what is going on here is that in reality, we had a relatively resilient consumption part. That is consumer spending. That is a good sign. Okay. Yes, it did come down a little bit, but it remained resilient at 1.8%. Now, government spending did fall. This is probably because the current administration has government initiatives to try to cut spending. But the one that matters is the last portion, the portion that is in parentheses, that is exports minus imports. This is usually negative because the United States runs a trade deficit. But because Trump has threatened and implemented tariffs multiple times, he has implemented, threatened, removed, implemented, threatened, removed, that cycle multiple times. Okay? Because of that, you had a higher than you otherwise would have rush of imports into the US economy. Primarily because businesses are trying to build inventory to get ahead of any potential tariffs, because tariffs would disrupt supply chains. They would make inventory more expensive, which means they would make cost of goods more expensive, which means prices rise, right? That's how we get from tariffs to inflation. But companies preemptively, I mean, you saw Apple do this. Like they put 1 million iPhones on a plane and flew them over. That is trying to get ahead of tariffs. So because of this specifically, this GDP reading was negative. We actually had an over 4%. When it comes to that parentheses section, we had over 4% deduction of GDP, which had to be carried by the other 3 parts, which is consumer spending, business investment, consumer consumption, business investment, and government spending. That had to carry the rest. Okay, when you factor all this in, you ended up with a negative 0.3% GDP growth number for this quarter. Okay, now the big question. Does that mean that we're entering into recession? Because if we have another quarter of this, we would enter a technical recession. Most people consider 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth to be a recession. With that said, that is not the official definition of a recession. What is the official definition of a recession? Well, it is when NBER declares one. Okay, that is the National Bureau of Economic Research. They are in charge, basically, or they are who people look at to actually declare a recession. So will that happen? We'll have to see. Will 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth happen? Maybe. But when you actually look at it in totality, consumer spending, which is consumption, remains relatively strong. That is now they did pull back. Consumers did pull back, but that is a relatively decent sign. We're not in red territory where alarm bells are flashing, okay? This is primarily due to how GDP is calculated. because of how GDP is calculated, we got a negative reading this quarter. Now, what I find interesting is Trump blaming Biden. In reality, and I think it's clear as day, this is primary, even if you are a Trump supporter, this is 100% Trump's fault. So what I would have preferred to see is Trump to basically go on air and describe what is going on and describe how tariffs would obviously affect this and how this isn't really a huge, major red sign for the economy. This is simply due to the formula. Instead, he went on air to blame the previous president and use the previous president as a scapegoat. Now, I don't want to move away from economics and finance too much, but obviously the media is going to run with this. The media is going to basically put articles out there. So I understand how for the average person, you just see a negative GDP reading, which is why I'm making a video like this so people can understand a little bit better. My previous video was also on this topic, okay? It's just a negative GDP reading because of how the formula is, or excuse me, the identity is calculated. But I don't see alarm bells yet. Now, if we start to see consumer spending come down, or we start to see other red flags, then potentially. Right now, this is very clearly because of imports, because companies are trying to get ahead of the tariffs. Now, right now, the majority of tariffs are paused for 90 days. Okay, we're going to have to see at the end of those 90 days, which is more like 65, 70 days at this point, we're going to have to see if those tariffs are implemented or not. Are they scaled back? Are they scaled up? Are different tariffs threatened? I don't know. But because of this, we've seen this massive increase in the trade deficit because of imports, because of companies trying to get ahead of the tariffs. So yes, this is clear as day. I think this is hard to argue that this is clear as day that it is Trump's fault. Now, we can argue whether it's a bad thing or not, but it's pretty certain that it is because of Trump's policies. Now, it becomes a bad thing if we start getting economic contraction. We'll have to see if that happens. I hope this video was informative. I just wanted to get this out there because I think GDP is just a number. People think that it's just, gross domestic product. We need to make it go up every time. And we should, theoretically, the market needs to go up every time for literally everything to work, if not everything falls apart. That means retirement accounts, the stock market, everything falls apart if GDP doesn't consistently grow. So yes, because of that, it's kind of a negative. But at the same time, it's just a formula. GDP is just calculated. It's just basically what's known as the national income identity. That's just how it is. So because of that, we had a negative reading. Again, I don't want to drag this video out too long. If you like personal finance, world economics, and investing broken down simply, you are in the right place. So I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, take care.